I'm going to do a little demonstration here. Another guitar tone video. People always want to sound like a particular era. They want the 80s sound, or they want the 70s stoner sound, or they want the whatever sort of era they're looking for. They're looking to sound like. They're looking to sound like a particular album as well. It's always about recordings and stuff like that. Now, for the demonstration that I can do here, all I can use is something to just get you the near enough basic sounds of each era throughout the history of hard rock and heavy metal. You know, from the 60s right up to the present day, if possible. Like I say, this isn't 100% reliable, but I can do the best for you with the gear that I have for the limited technology that I have right here. Before we get into the interesting parts here, the actual playing, demonstration of these tones, I would like to give you a slight history lesson of it all. Basically, since the 1960s, when hard rock certainly came about with the likes of Hendrix and Cream and all that sort of stuff, into the sort of Zeppelin era, a lot of the vintage amps were used back then. You couldn't really get a lot of the sounds in the era of the Who and whatnot. They used to do certain things like slash the speakers. They really did, with a razor blade, slashing all the speakers to get that breakup. You know, and you crank the volume so hard, you're almost destroying your amp pretty much. And then you got into your, certainly from Hendrix onwards, you got into your Marshall stack thing. You know, your Plexis, JTM 45s, all of that game. And probably one or two other makes as well that were doing stuff like that. And the amps in the 60s, coming into the 70s, you know, you couldn't really, there wasn't a lot you could get out of those amps. But the other thing about those vintage amplifiers, the genuine article, and they'd be well expensive nowadays to get hold of one of those, I would think. I don't know that market very well, so I don't know my facts, but I can guess now. But a lot of those amps certainly had a very rich and powerful mid-range, you know, which you can certainly hear on all those early rock records. You know, when they started to get a slightly overdriven sound and that sort of thing, it was all through just winding those amps up, and that tone continued into the 70s with your like Thin Lizzy, AC/DC, Uriah Heep, all of those bands, you know. So, you know, all the vintage hard rock bands and that, until you start getting into the sort of Van Halen era, and then into the 80s with the likes of George Lynch, Randy Rhoads, Jakey Lee, all this kind of thing. A lot of those players still used the vintage Marshall stacks and heads and all that sort of thing, but the thing about those amps then is they were modified. A lot of them were hot rodded to get that extra stage of gain, and also there was more pedals on the market, overdrive pedals and distortion pedals and that, used for pushing amps harder. That certainly came about as well, and that was certainly a thing in the 80s, you know. So to be able to get you into that sort of shred zone and what have you, so you were able to control the sounds a lot better. In the late 80s, which was more the extreme metal thing, into the, of course, and throughout the 90s, throughout a death metal scene, you know, from the thrash to the death metal scene like that, apart from the likes of Metallica, but a lot of the underground bands, they used whatever they could find, and they wanted the most aggressive, horrible, distorted sound you could possibly get. A lot of it was very trebly as well. A lot of it was very fizzy. A lot of amplifiers on the market at that time were voiced to give you that more aggressive sound, that more cutting, cutthroat sound, a lot less mids and things like that. So, and of course the pickups, there was a lot more of those on the market. And then when the high gain amps, you know, like the dual rectifier and 5150s and that sort of thing, you know, they were well expensive at the beginning, and those were like, there was only, from what I can remember, and Marshall were just catching up with high gain amps, proper high gain, serious high gain stuff. And of course there was rack mount gear as well, like from behind me you can see there, like the ADA. That was quite popular in the late 80s, early 90s, and several other companies did similar products. Okay, so into the year 2000s and up to the present day nowadays, it's like the technology is vast, there's a lot more gear on the market, and the tones are also a lot better as well, so you can get a crushing, brutal sound, and you can get the note definition as well. Starting at the beginning, the 60s. The 70s hard rock era. Now to 80s hard rock and heavy metal, time to shred. Late 80s thrash into the 90s extreme metal. Lot of fizz, that. Yeah. From the 2000s to the present day. A lot thicker, a lot denser, a lot more heavy, and a lot more well defined. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed the video going through the history of all guitar tones in rock and metal. And at the end of the day, the bottom line is it was all to do with availability of resources and experience. If you're on YouTube, please hit subscribe below and check out the links.